Welcome back to Harlem Stories. Today, we dive into the life of one of the most legendary and controversial figures in American crime history, Bumpy Johnson. He was Harlem's undisputed kingpin, a man who ruled the streets with intelligence, power, and ruthless determination. Some saw him as a violent criminal. Others viewed him as a protector of the community, a modern-day Robin Hood who stood up against injustice and helped the people of Harlem when no one else would. But who was the real Bumpy Johnson? Was he a ruthless gangster who built his empire through fear and violence? Or was he a complex man shaped by the harsh realities of his time? Tonight, we uncover the true story behind the legend. Born as Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy Johnson grew up during a period of extreme racial discrimination in America. His nickname, Bumpy, came from a bump on the back of his head, a small detail that would later become known across the criminal underworld of New York City. As a child, Bumpy was intelligent, quiet, and observant. But life in the segregated South was brutal for black families. Opportunities were limited, violence was common, and many African Americans were forced to survive in systems designed to keep them powerless. When Bumpy was still young, his older brother was accused of killing a white man. Fearing racial violence and lynching, his family sent him north to Harlem, hoping he would find a better future. At the time, Harlem was exploding with culture, music, and creativity. The Harlem Renaissance had transformed the neighborhood into the center of black art and intellectual life in America. Jazz clubs filled the streets, writers and musicians became legends, and Harlem represented hope and freedom for many African Americans. But beneath the music and glamour was another reality. Poverty, crime, illegal gambling, and organized gangs controlled much of the neighborhood. And in this dangerous world, Bumpy Johnson quickly learned how power worked. Unlike many gangsters of his era, Bumpy wasn't just physically intimidating. He was highly intelligent. He loved reading books, writing poetry, and studying philosophy. He could quote Shakespeare while sitting in smoky backrooms filled with criminals and mobsters. People who met him often described him as calm, calculating, and extremely disciplined. As he entered adulthood, Bumpy became involved with Harlem's underground economy. During the 1930s, illegal gambling operations known as numbers rackets generated huge amounts of money throughout New York City. The streets were controlled by powerful crime bosses who fought constantly for territory and influence. One of the most feared figures in Harlem at the time was Stephanie St. Clair, also known as Madam Queen. She controlled major gambling operations and resisted attempts by the Italian Mafia to take over Harlem's criminal businesses. Bumpy Johnson became one of her top enforcers. This was the beginning of his rise to power. The Italian Mafia, led by infamous mobsters like Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz, wanted complete control over Harlem's profitable rackets. Violence erupted across the city as different criminal organizations fought for dominance. Bumpy proved himself to be fearless. Stories about him spread quickly. Rivals feared his reputation for violence and retaliation. According to many accounts, Bumpy handled conflicts personally and demanded loyalty from everyone around him. But what made him unique was his ability to navigate both worlds, the streets of Harlem and the powerful Italian Mafia families controlling organized crime in New York. After Dutch Schultz was assassinated in 1935, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Bumpy Johnson eventually formed a working relationship with Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in American history. This alliance changed everything. Through this partnership, Bumpy effectively became the ruler of Harlem's criminal underworld while working alongside the Italian Mafia rather than fighting against them. It was an unusual arrangement during a deeply segregated era in America. Bumpy controlled gambling operations, loans, protection rackets, and eventually drug trafficking throughout parts of Harlem. Money flowed through the streets, and his influence grew stronger every year. Yet despite his criminal empire, many residents of Harlem respected him. Why? Because Bumpy Johnson often gave back to the community. According to numerous stories, he helped struggling families pay rent, bought food for the poor, and supported local businesses. Some people claimed he paid for children's school clothes and quietly donated money to those in need. In neighborhoods ignored by politicians and law enforcement, figures like Bumpy sometimes became symbols of protection and survival. To many Harlem residents, he wasn't just a gangster. He was their gangster. That image helped build the myth surrounding him. But the reality was far more complicated. Bumpy Johnson's empire was built on illegal activities, intimidation, and violence. People disappeared. Rivals were beaten or killed. Fear was an essential part of maintaining power in the criminal underworld. Law enforcement agencies constantly targeted him. Police raids, arrests, and investigations followed him for decades. Still, he always seemed to survive. Part of his success came from his intelligence. Unlike reckless criminals who attracted attention, Bumpy preferred careful planning. He maintained connections with influential people and understood how to operate within a corrupt system. He also carried himself differently from other gangsters. Bumpy dressed elegantly, spoke intelligently, and valued respect above everything else. Even his enemies admitted he had charisma and discipline. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, his legend continued growing. Harlem itself was changing rapidly. Economic struggles increased, drugs spread throughout neighborhoods, and organized crime evolved into even more dangerous forms. One of the darkest chapters of Bumpy Johnson's story involved heroin trafficking. During the post-war years, heroin devastated communities across America, especially urban neighborhoods like Harlem. Many historians believe organized crime groups profited enormously from narcotics, and Bumpy's name became connected to the growing heroin trade. This transformed public perception of him. While some still viewed him as a protector, others saw him as part of the destruction consuming Harlem from within. The truth remains debated even today. Some former associates denied his involvement in drugs, claiming he avoided narcotics because of the damage they caused. Others insist heroin became one of the biggest sources of wealth for criminal organizations connected to him. Like many figures from organized crime history, separating fact from myth is difficult. What is certain is that Bumpy Johnson became one of the most influential underworld figures in Harlem's history. But power in the criminal world never lasts forever. In 1951, authorities finally struck a major blow against him. Bumpy was arrested on federal drug conspiracy charges and sentenced to prison. For many crime bosses, prison meant the end. But not for Bumpy Johnson. Even behind bars, stories about him continued circulating through Harlem. His reputation only grew larger. He became almost mythical, a symbol of old-school gangster culture during an era when organized crime dominated American cities. After serving years in prison, Bumpy returned to Harlem in the 1960s. But the neighborhood he came back to was different. A new generation controlled the streets. Civil rights movements were reshaping America. Young activists challenged racism openly, while communities faced increasing poverty and violence. Despite these changes, Bumpy still commanded respect. One of the most famous stories from this period involves his reported friendship with Malcolm X. The two men represented very different worlds, one a revolutionary activist, the other a notorious gangster, yet they shared mutual respect. Both understood Harlem deeply and recognized the struggles facing Black Americans during that time. Some accounts suggest Malcolm X used his influence to encourage criminals and gang members to support community stability and avoid violence during important political events. Whether all the stories are accurate remains uncertain, but the connection between Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson became another important part of Harlem legend. As the years passed, Bumpy's health began declining. The streets he once controlled had changed. New criminal organizations emerged, and the old mafia systems were evolving rapidly. Still, whenever Bumpy walked through Harlem, people recognized him. He had become larger than life. To some, he was a dangerous criminal responsible for violence and illegal activity that harmed countless lives. To others, he represented resistance, a man who gained power in a society that denied opportunities to Black Americans. This dual image is what makes Bumpy Johnson such a fascinating figure even today. His story reflects the complicated reality of Harlem itself. A place filled with creativity, struggle, survival, ambition, and conflict. In July 1968, Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack while eating at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He died shortly afterward at the age of 62. News of his death spread quickly through New York City. The two men represented very different worlds, one a revolutionary activist, the other a notorious gangster, yet they shared mutual respect. Both understood Harlem deeply and recognized the struggles facing Black Americans during that time. Some accounts suggest Malcolm X used his influence to encourage criminals and gang members to support community stability and avoid violence during important political events. Whether all the stories are accurate remains uncertain, but the connection between Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson became another important part of Harlem legend. As the years passed, Bumpy's health began declining. The streets he once controlled had changed. New criminal organizations emerged, and the old mafia systems were evolving rapidly. Still, whenever Bumpy walked through Harlem, people recognized him. He had become larger than life. To some, he was a dangerous criminal responsible for violence and illegal activity that harmed countless lives. To others, he represented resistance, a man who gained power in a society that denied opportunities to Black Americans. This dual image is what makes Bumpy Johnson such a fascinating figure even today. His story reflects the complicated reality of Harlem itself. A place filled with creativity, struggle, survival, ambition, and conflict. In July 1968, Bumpy Johnson suffered a heart attack while eating at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He died shortly afterward at the age of 62. News of his death spread quickly through New York City. For many Harlem residents, it felt like the end of an era. Even after his death, the legend of Bumpy Johnson continued growing through books, documentaries, interviews, and movies. Popular culture transformed him into one of America's most iconic gangsters. Films and television series introduced his story to new generations, often portraying him as a brilliant strategist caught between crime, racism, and survival. But historians continue debating who he truly was. Was Bumpy Johnson a community protector who used illegal power to help Harlem survive during difficult times? Or was he simply a ruthless criminal whose empire caused suffering beneath the surface? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. The world Bumpy lived in was shaped by racism, poverty, corruption, and limited opportunities. Many people turned to crime because legitimate paths to success were blocked or unavailable. That doesn't excuse violence or illegal activity. But it helps explain why figures like Bumpy Johnson became so influential. He understood power better than most people around him. He knew how fear worked, how loyalty worked, and how survival worked in the streets of Harlem. And unlike many gangsters, he also understood the importance of image. Bumpy carefully cultivated his reputation. He wanted people to see him as intelligent, honorable, and connected to the community. That image protected him almost as much as violence did. Even decades later, his story continues capturing public imagination because it represents more than organized crime. It represents the contradictions of America itself. A nation where opportunity and oppression often existed side by side. A nation where some criminals became folk heroes because communities felt abandoned by institutions meant to protect them. And a nation where legends sometimes become bigger than reality. Today, Harlem is very different from the neighborhood Bumpy Johnson once ruled. Yet his name still echoes through its history. Tourists hear stories about him. Historians analyze his influence. Filmmakers recreate his life. And people continue debating whether he was a villain, a hero, or something far more complicated. Perhaps that mystery is why his legend refuses to die. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't simply a gangster. He was a product of his time, his environment, and the harsh realities of a divided America. His life was filled with ambition, violence, loyalty, intelligence, and contradiction. And in many ways, Harlem's history cannot be told without mentioning his name. Thank you for watching Harlem Stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Bumpy Johnson, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more documentaries exploring the hidden stories of America's most legendary crime figures. Until next time, stay curious, and keep exploring history's darkest legends.